Have you ever been told, without words, that you didn't belong somewhere? That a seat with your name on it wasn't really meant for you? On an ordinary Friday afternoon, a woman boarded a flight with a valid ticket and walked straight into a storm she didn't start, but refused to walk away from. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in your shoulders, a New York Friday afternoon where everything looked a little grayer than it really was. Inside Hudson Gateway Terminal, the first-class lounge of Altair Skyways gave off a quiet hush, the kind only money seemed to know how to buy. A woman wearing too much perfume tapped her nails on a sleek glass table. Someone in a suit mumbled into a headset. The scent of leather chairs mingled with expensive cologne and coffee that had been reheated too many times. In the far corner, where the noise seemed to hesitate, sat Zarina Claiborne. Her legs were crossed at the ankle, hands resting on a weathered carry-on, and her eyes, though tired, stayed open. She wore an olive-green utility jacket, the kind that had seen airports in every time zone. Her jeans were neat but simple, her shoes flat and scuffed from walking more than they were meant to. No flashy watch, no jewelry, just a phone in her hand, the screen glowing with a picture of a little girl holding up a hand-drawn sign that read, "Welcome home, Mommy." Zarina exhaled quietly. 3 days of closed-door meetings with internal investors, numbers, projections, and restructuring plans. No one in those rooms had spoken to her differently once they knew her title, Senior Strategic Advisor and part owner of Altair Skyways. But here in the lounge, she was just another woman too worn out to look the part. The overhead speaker cracked to life. Altair Flight 812 to Chicago is now boarding all first-class passengers. Please proceed to gate 14. Zarina stood slowly, rolling her bag behind her, and walked toward the gate. Her pace was steady, her expression calm. She'd done this more times than she could count. At gate 14, a woman in her 50s stood like she belonged there, polished, pressed, and perfectly rehearsed. Merritt Halbrook, the lead flight attendant, wore a crisp navy uniform and an expression that flickered between polite and suspicious. She was flipping through the digital manifest when Zarina approached. "Good afternoon," Zarina said, offering her boarding pass. Merritt gave a short smile, barely there, and scanned the pass. Her brow furrowed, barely. A beat passed. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This boarding lane is for first-class passengers only." Zarina didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. "I am flying first class. That's my seat, 2A. Merritt hesitated just long enough to confirm the name on the screen. She didn't offer an apology, only, "Do you have identification?" Zarina handed over her license without a word. Merritt looked it over like she'd been handed a forged check, then finally nodded, forcing a customer service smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You may board." Zarina walked on without a sound. She didn't want trouble, didn't want attention. All she wanted was to sink into seat 2A, sip something warm, and watch the clouds drift by until Chicago came into view. Seat 2A welcomed her with its wide cushion, leather stitching, and faint scent of lemon-scented sanitizer. She stored her bag, adjusted the seat, and let her head fall back. The hush of first class felt like relief, until it didn't. Footsteps approached, deliberate. 2 sets. Merritt's voice returned, cooler than before. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane. You're not properly dressed for this section. We have standards to maintain." Zarina blinked, unsure she heard correctly. "Excuse me." "You're not dressed appropriately," Merritt repeated, "and I have the right to deny boarding if I feel a passenger doesn't align with the standards of first class." Zarina sat straighter. "Even with a valid ticket?" Merritt didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to step out and speak with security." The cabin had gone quiet. People turned, but no one said anything. A man coughed lightly, then pretended to focus on his phone. A woman tugged at her scarf, eyes low. Zarina looked Merritt dead in the eyes. There was no heat in her expression, just the weight of something that had lived there too long. Disappointment, familiarity, the ache of being sized up and dismissed with one glance. She could have argued. She could have named names, shown credentials, pulled up her stock portfolio. But she didn't. Instead, she sat in silence until two uniformed airport security staff appeared. One leaned toward her, voice lowered. "Ma'am, please come with us." Zarina stood. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for understanding. But as she walked past Merritt, her eyes said it all. This wasn't over. Not this time. The room was plain, cold, and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. The walls were the color of wet concrete, and the only furniture was a metal table bolted to the floor and two plastic chairs that creaked with every shift of weight. There were no windows, just one flickering overhead light and a small vent that hummed louder than it should have. Zarina Claiborne sat in one of those chairs, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her carry-on bag placed carefully at her feet. No one had cuffed her. No one raised their voice. But the way the TSA agents looked at her, like she might suddenly become a problem, was loud in its own way. One of them, a young man who hadn't looked her in the eye once, asked her to confirm her name, birth date, and destination. The other rifled through her bag with blue-gloved hands, flipping through paperwork, glancing at a book she brought, then tossing it back in. Zarina didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She already knew, and not because anyone had said the words. They never did. But she knew the tone, the glances, the silence. She sat still, her eyes finding the one corner of the room where a small piece of mirror had been screwed into the wall. It distorted her reflection, just slightly enough to make her question it. She saw herself there, calm, quiet, dressed modestly, tired, and yet threatening. The memories rose fast and uninvited. That landlord in Boston who said the apartment had just been rented, right after reading her name. The boutique where she'd been followed aisle to aisle until she left, empty-handed. The day she'd gotten accepted to Harvard, and her counselor said, "You must have had a great diversity essay." And now, here. Again. The door creaked open. A woman stepped in, young, maybe mid-20s, her posture stiff and her eyes unsure. Behind her came a man in a cheap blazer, holding a clipboard like it gave him authority. "Ms. Claiborne," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. We just want to ask you a few questions." Zarina didn't respond right away. She looked at the girl. The uniform, the Altair Skyways pin, new, still shiny. The way she clutched her hands in front of her, twisting her fingers. "I'm Trina," the young woman said quietly. I was shadowing Ms. Halbrook on the flight." Zarina raised one eyebrow gently. "I'm sorry," Trina continued, voice trembling. "I didn't know they'd call security. I just followed protocol." Zarina studied her for a moment. Her voice, when it came, was measured. "Protocol doesn't erase dignity. You all need to remember that." Trina nodded once, almost reflexively, before glancing at the man beside her. He cleared his throat. "We're just trying to maintain brand image, you understand. In the premium cabin, presentation is part of the experience. It's not personal." Zarina turned her head slowly to look at him. "Does your brand image exclude people who look like me?" The man blinked, caught off guard. His lips parted like he might respond, but nothing came out. "I'd like to speak with someone higher," she said flatly. He hesitated, then turned and left the room, pulling Trina with him. The door clicked shut behind them. Zarina sat still for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone. No emotion on her face, just purpose. Her fingers moved quickly as she typed. "It's happening again, and this time it's on your watch." She hit send. The contact name, Desmond Virel. Thousands of miles away, in a glass-walled conference room at Altair Skyway's Chicago headquarters, Desmond was in the middle of a Zoom meeting. Charts on screen, voices discussing projected revenue dips, Q2 adjustments, possible staffing shifts. His phone buzzed once. He glanced down, read the message, and didn't say a word for several seconds. Then he closed his laptop. "Excuse me," he said to the others. "I have to step out." Desmond knew Zarina well. They'd worked together for years. She'd never been impulsive, never dramatic. If she texted something like that, something had gone very wrong. And if she wasn't yelling about it, that was worse. He grabbed his coat and moved quickly. Back in the small gray room, Zarina didn't put her phone away. She left it in her hand, screen dark, resting on her knee. Her back straight, her expression calm, but her eyes told another story. She wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her. She was waiting for the right moment to take back the space that had been quietly taken from her. She'd played nice for years, paid, performed, outworked everyone in the room. And still, here she was. Again. Questioned for being quiet, questioned for being tired, questioned for being her. But this time, she wasn't walking out the same way she walked in. Seat 2A sat empty, the blanket still folded neatly on the armrest, the wine glass untouched. The rest of the first-class cabin hummed with quiet activity. Seat adjustments, polite coughs, fingers tapping on phone screens. A few heads turned toward the vacant seat, but no one said anything out loud. People in first class often traveled alone. Maybe she missed the connection. Maybe she was rebooked. No one wanted to ask, but everyone noticed. Merritt Halbrook adjusted the corner of her scarf in the lavatory mirror before stepping back into the aisle. Her steps were precise, the click of her heels muffled by the thick carpet beneath her. She glanced toward 2A again, then down at the digital manifest on her tablet. The name was still there. Claiborne, Z confirmed ticket, first class. Her lips pressed into a line. She'd been doing this job for nearly 3 decades. She'd flown presidents, billionaires, foreign dignitaries. She'd been trained to spot details, posture, speech, even the luggage people carried. And somewhere along the way, she'd started believing she could tell who belonged and who didn't. Zarina Claiborne hadn't looked like she belonged. It wasn't the color of her skin, Merritt told herself again. It was the fatigue in her eyes, the simplicity of her clothes, the calmness in how she'd responded. She hadn't played the role, hadn't smiled too wide or acted impressed. She'd just boarded, like she had every right. That was what had unsettled Merritt. "Don't take it personal," she muttered under her breath, straightening a pillow at an empty seat. "This is just about standards." In the main cabin, Jonas Keene, who had taught U.S. history for 34 years, was staring down the aisle. He wasn't usually one to get involved, but something about the way the woman had been asked to leave, so quiet, so smooth, bothered him. He'd seen students treated that way. Smart ones, polite ones who didn't fit the image. He flagged down a passing flight attendant, a young man barely out of training. "Excuse me," Jonas said gently. "Why was that woman removed? She had a boarding pass, didn't she?" The young man looked startled. I'm not at liberty to discuss, sir." Jonas tilted his head slightly. "You mean you don't know, or you're not allowed to admit it?" The attendant flushed, offered a polite nod, and walked away without answering. Behind Jonas, a younger passenger, a woman with cropped hair and a nose ring, had filmed part of the interaction earlier. Now she was quietly uploading a video with the caption, "Woman removed from first class. She had a ticket. Didn't see her misbehave. Just didn't look rich." Altair Skyways explained. The post gained traction within minutes. Shares turned into retweets, likes into outrage. Commenters asked who she was. What had she done? Some tagged journalists. Others began sharing their own stories of being questioned, ignored, moved. In the VIP suite of the terminal, Zarina sat in a quiet armchair near a wall of windows. She wasn't offered an apology. She wasn't offered an explanation either. Instead, a man from the airline's legal team stood across from her, tablet in hand, sweat collecting just below his collar. "We can put you on the next flight," he said. "Private cabin. No cost to you, of course." Zarina didn't smile. She didn't even blink. "Has Merritt Halbrook been told who I am?" The man hesitated. "I don't believe so." Zarina leaned forward slightly. "Let's not turn this into a media incident, Ms. Claiborne. We value your privacy." She stared at him. "Then you should have valued my dignity first." Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. It was a call from Desmond Varel. She answered. "Zarina." Desmond's voice was low. "I just got out of the meeting. I saw the video. We're grounding the flight." Zarina didn't respond at first. Then quietly, "You sure you want to go that far?" Desmond didn't pause. "Yes, because I know you would have." Back on the plane, a soft chime rang through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay due to an administrative review. We appreciate your patience. Merritt turned from where she stood near the galley. Her hand froze mid-motion as she poured water into a glass. A younger attendant leaned in, whispered something, then stepped back. The color drained from Merritt's face, not from fear but from recognition. She reached for her tablet again. The name was still there. Z. Claiborne. Jonas, still seated in row 12C, pulled out his phone as it buzzed. A text from his colleague back home. Hey, that woman you saw, someone just said she's on the board of Altair. She's a co-owner. He looked back down the aisle toward first class. Suddenly, the curtain between cabins didn't feel like fabric anymore. It felt like something else entirely, something heavier, and now finally starting to tear. The VIP room was quiet in that deliberate, expensive way. No televisions blaring, no airport chatter echoing down tile corridors. Just the soft hum of air conditioning and the occasional clink of glass against marble. Zarina Claiborne sat by the tall window, hands resting on her knees, watching a fuel truck roll slowly across the tarmac. Somewhere out there, the plane she'd been removed from sat stalled on the runway. She hadn't touched the glass of water the attendant offered. It was sweating onto a linen napkin. Her phone buzzed again, and again. Notifications from news alerts, texts from colleagues, emails with subject lines like, "Are you okay?" and "This is blowing up." But Zarina hadn't opened any of them. Not yet. She wasn't looking for reactions. She was searching for clarity. Her reflection in the window was faint, but she could see enough. The lines under her eyes, the calm held just behind her brow. It wasn't fear she felt, not even anger. It was something else, something deeper. If I stay quiet now, she murmured to herself, who's next? She remembered what Desmond once told her when she first took her seat at the table, when she became more than just a strategist but a stakeholder. We don't need more people who know the system, he said. We need more people who've been hurt by it to start rewriting it. She hadn't planned to rewrite anything today. She just wanted to fly home, see her daughter, maybe order Thai takeout and go to bed early. But this wasn't the kind of moment you could sleep off. She picked up her phone and called Desmond. They grounded the flight, he said before she could speak. You already did it? I watched the video, he said, and then I made a call. There was a pause. I'll get back on the plane, Zarina said, but not quietly. She ended the call. At Altair's headquarters in Chicago, Desmond walked into the operations office, his jaw set. I need Merritt Halbrook's full incident record, he said to the compliance officer. Within minutes, her file was projected on the glass wall. 2 passenger complaints flagged for racial insensitivity, 1 undocumented verbal warning after a confrontation with a Southeast Asian family, a note from HR suggesting reassignment to economy service. Never followed up. Desmond read through it silently, then looked at the room. No more saving face, he said. Back at the airport, Flight 812 remained idle. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted. People were whispering, checking their phones. Someone up front had said the woman removed earlier owned part of the airline. A teenage passenger in row 17 Googled her name and found it. Zarina Claiborne, strategic advisor, board member, investor. In seat 12C, Jonas scrolled through his feed. The clip he'd seen earlier now had over 100,000 views. The caption beneath it read, "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue, but she still got kicked off." He showed it to the woman next to him. She's not just a passenger, he said. She's the one who makes the decisions. And they treated her like that anyway. The woman looked toward the front of the plane. Are we in a PR nightmare? Jonas shrugged. Feels more like a reckoning. Outside, a black SUV pulled up near the aircraft. Zarina stepped out. Same jacket, same shoes. But something had changed. Her pace was purposeful, her eyes steady. A manager in a navy blazer followed closely behind. They boarded together. Inside the cabin, Merritt stood near the cockpit, lips tight, hands folded in front of her. When she saw Zarina, her face tensed, not with guilt, with confusion. Like she didn't know what was happening, but knew she wasn't in control anymore. The manager stepped forward. Ms. Claiborne is returning to her seat. You are to step off the aircraft immediately. Merritt's voice cracked before she could stop it. Excuse me? The manager didn't blink. As of this moment, you're relieved of duty pending formal termination. You may collect your belongings now. Merritt opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Zarina, but Zarina didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply looked at her, calm and clear. It wasn't vengeance. It was accountability. As Merritt moved down the aisle, her steps stiff, she passed Trina, who had watched it all, hands clenched at her sides. Zarina paused beside her. "It's not too late to be better," she said softly. Then she continued to seat 2A and sat down. This time no one questioned her. Not the flight attendant pouring water. Not the passenger pretending to read. Not the man across the aisle adjusting his cufflinks. The plane door closed. Zarina leaned back against the headrest and looked out at the clouds gathering. She hadn't reclaimed her seat just for herself. She cleared the way for others to claim theirs. The plane moved through the clouds with a stillness that didn't feel natural. People barely spoke. The usual chatter about hotel bookings, tight connections, or what to order for dinner was replaced by long glances and quiet scrolling on phone screens. The buzz of the engine hummed like background tension no one dared to address. Zarina sat in seat 2A, spine straight, arms resting gently on the armrests. The tray table remained stowed, the welcome drink untouched. Her reflection in the window barely held shape in the gray sky beyond. From the outside, she looked composed, but inside something was shifting. She had her seat back, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a reminder. She thought about the thousands of travelers who didn't have a title to shield them. People whose names never made it into boardrooms. People who were told in subtle ways, every day, that they didn't belong in certain spaces. Not because of what they'd done, but because of how they looked, how they dressed, how they carried themselves after a long week. "If I stay silent now," she whispered to herself, "I'm just another privileged woman correcting a personal insult. But if I speak—" She opened her laptop. The screen blinked awake, showing a half-finished document titled Company Culture 2030. She highlighted the title, deleted it, and typed something new. "What we choose to see and what we choose to erase." The words felt heavier than they looked. She adjusted her seat upright, reached for her earbuds, and opened the recording app on her phone. The cabin around her remained hushed. A few rows ahead, a man clicked through spreadsheets on his tablet. Across the aisle, a woman flipped pages in a business magazine without reading. Zarina pressed record. "Today, I was removed from a flight because someone believed I didn't belong in a seat I had paid for. Not because I was disruptive, not because I was dangerous, but because I looked tired, because I looked ordinary, because I looked black." Her voice didn't shake. She spoke the way one might read a weather report, steady, clear, unapologetic. "This isn't about me. I'm lucky. I have a voice and a title. But too many don't. Too many are forced to swallow humiliation and stay quiet because speaking up might cost them everything." She paused, her eyes drifting again toward the clouds. "So this is for them." She stopped the recording. No tears, no anger, just focus. She trimmed the audio, pulled a still frame from the cabin window, and uploaded it as a video with subtitles. Then she sent the full version to Altair's internal communications team. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't need to. But before she put the phone away, she opened her personal social account. It was modest, maybe a couple hundred followers, mostly former colleagues and community contacts. She posted the short version of the video with one sentence. Not just about a seat, about the silence we let grow around it. 15 minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Then again, her inbox lit up. One share from a former airline staffer turned activist. Then another from a professor of organizational ethics. Then a journalist. An hour passed. The view count crossed 2 million. People began posting their own stories. A woman in Charlotte recalled being asked to switch seats because her toddler made another passenger uncomfortable. A man in Houston described being questioned twice about whether he really had a business class ticket. The stories weren't new, but now they had a thread to hold them together. Back at Altair headquarters, Desmond sat in a windowless room, surrounded by executives with anxious eyes and stiff suits. The PR team was scrambling, the legal department already drafting statements. But Desmond didn't speak right away. He pressed play on the video. The room fell silent. When it ended, a voice broke the stillness. "She's put us in a very public position," one of the VPs muttered. "You think she did this to pressure us?" Desmond looked at him. I think she did it to pressure herself to stop playing safe." He stood. "And now we have to decide whether we keep playing safe too." On board the plane, Trina approached quietly and placed a cup of tea on Zarina's tray. No words at first, then softly, "Thank you for saying what so many of us are afraid to." Zarina looked up, met her eyes and nodded. Not as a superior, not as an executive, just as someone who remembered being young and afraid to speak. "You're allowed to want better," she said, "even when you're new." Trina smiled nervously, but it reached her eyes this time. A few rows behind, Jonas watched from his seat. He opened Twitter and found the video. As he listened to the final lines, something stirred in him, an ache he hadn't named in years. "I'm not just asking for a seat," the voice said. "I'm asking we stop making people prove they deserve to be seen." He closed his eyes. A memory floated up, of a student who dropped out after being mocked for being the only black kid in his AP history class. Jonas had told himself he couldn't do much, that it wasn't his place. He shared the post. This time, he didn't stay silent. The elevators at Altair's headquarters in downtown Chicago opened with a muted chime, but the hallway outside the executive boardroom buzzed with tension. Staffers whispered by the coffee stations, journalists pressed against the lobby glass, and IT assistants rushed between cubicles like it was a newsroom on election night. The building had never felt this alive or this on edge. Zarina Claiborne arrived at exactly 9 a.m. She carried no briefcase, no legal representation, just her phone in one hand and a slim manila folder in the other. Her expression was unreadable. She didn't wave to anyone, didn't slow down. She walked straight through the glass doors of the conference room, past a half-dozen eyes that couldn't decide whether to be grateful or afraid. The room had been designed for control: polished walnut table, soundproof walls, leather swivel chairs, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. But this morning, it couldn't contain the unease. 16 seats, all filled. Some board members nodded at Zarina. Others kept their arms folded, their faces drawn tight with corporate politeness. The chair of the meeting, a sharp-suited executive named Paul Renner, cleared his throat. "Ms. Claiborne, while we empathize with your experience, the way you chose to publicize it, well, it caught us off guard." Zarina didn't blink. "And that's the problem," she said quietly. "The only thing that caught you off guard wasn't that it happened, but that it happened to someone with power." There was a pause. Not even the HVAC system dared to hum. One of the longer-tenured board members, Riley Sumner, leaned back, fingers steepled together. What Merritt did wasn't personal, it was procedural. She followed her instincts. "Instinct," Zarina interrupted, "is where bias hides best, especially when it gets rewarded in silence." The room fell into a long, uncomfortable silence. Zarina reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Then she opened her laptop and connected it to the projector. The screen behind her lit up with the title slide, "Rebuilding Altair, Humanity Before Optics." She clicked the remote slowly, speaking over each bullet point. First, an independent internal bias audit team with access to anonymized complaints. Unfiltered, unburied. Click. Second, a mandatory retraining program called Human First Protocol for all service-facing roles. It's not about PR polish. It's about how people show up when no one's filming. Click. Third, a formal public apology from the CEO. Not a soft corporate statement, but one that admits we failed, not once, but systemically. She set down the clicker. And if you're asking what will happen if we don't do it, then you haven't seen how quickly silence gets replaced. No one responded, until Desmond Burrell, seated near the window, folded his arms across his chest and said simply, "I support her. And if we want Altair to survive this decade, we better start flying different, not just higher." It wasn't a standing ovation, but no one spoke up to object, and that said enough. Zarina didn't linger. She nodded once and left the room the same way she came in, alone and unshaken. Elsewhere in the building, inside a much quieter, smaller space, Merritt Hallbrook was packing the last of her belongings into a cardboard box. A folded scarf, a framed photo of her dog, a worn lanyard. No one had come by to say goodbye. A younger flight attendant paused by the door. "You okay?" she asked. Merritt didn't look up. "I thought I was protecting a standard," she said, not bitterly, but like someone confessing something that had taken years to see. "Turns out I was just protecting a version of comfort that only worked for people who look like me." She taped the box shut and walked out without another word. Later that week, clips from Zarina's proposal began making their way into industry news, then into HR conferences, then into crew briefings across the country. Flight attendants, gate agents, customer service reps, people who had never been asked what they thought, began sharing their own stories. At first, it was just a trickle, but soon more followed. Doctors, teachers, students, people who'd been made to feel small for not fitting someone else's expectation of belonging. Zarina turned down every TV interview request, every news outlet invitation, but she said yes to one thing: a podcast recorded in a back room of a diner near O'Hare Airport. It was run by a former flight attendant who now taught de-escalation workshops to service workers. Zarina sat across from him, microphone clipped to her collar, no script in hand. "I'm not looking for apologies," she said. "I'm looking for admission, that we've let too many passengers board with shame instead of welcome." That clip alone racked up 1 million plays. By the time she returned home, the lights in her kitchen were dim. Her old suitcase still carried dust on the handle. She placed it by the door, slipped off her shoes, and sat at the kitchen table. She reached for the piece of paper her daughter had left for her the night before she flew out. A crayon drawing of a plane, stick figure passengers inside, one taller figure standing near the door, holding up a heart. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, "Mom helps people sit where they belong." Zarina smiled to herself, small and tired, but more grounded than she'd been in years. Because in the end, it wasn't about policy, it was about dignity, and she'd finally chosen to protect that, loudly. The hangar smelled faintly of oil and old metal, a reminder of its past life as a maintenance depot. Now it had been swept clean, strung with soft lights, and filled with rows of folding chairs that stretched across the concrete floor, like pews in an unfinished chapel. There were no banners, no dramatic music, just a small, simple stage, a microphone on a stand, and 600 employees seated beneath the shadow of an old Altair Skyways fuselage. They came from all corners of the company: baggage handlers in windbreakers, mechanics in grease-stained overalls, flight attendants in casual dress, even a few pilots still in uniform, accountants, admin assistants, corporate executives in polos instead of suits. For once, titles didn't seem to matter. The event was called the Belonging Briefing, but most people just referred to it as that hangar thing. Zarina Claiborne walked onto the stage with no fanfare. No camera crew followed. No applause greeted her. She wore dark slacks and a pale blue shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She looked out at the crowd for a long moment before speaking. "I know some of you are tired of hearing about that flight," she began. "I am too, but not for the same reason." Her voice was steady, clear. No microphone was needed in the acoustics of the hangar. "I'm tired," she said, "because I know how many of you have stories like mine. Some even worse. You just didn't have the position or the platform to make anyone listen." A quiet fell over the room that felt deeper than silence. A woman in the middle row dropped her eyes to the floor. Beside her, a senior attendant gently clasped the hand of a new hire. No one moved. No one needed to. Zarina didn't raise her voice. "Today isn't about punishment. It's about a question we should be asking ourselves, on every flight, at every gate, behind every desk. Who do we think deserves welcome, and why?" She let the question hang there. In the back row, Merritt Hallbrook sat in a folding chair, her coat folded in her lap. She hadn't worn her uniform. She hadn't come with a badge or an agenda, just a quietness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When the Q&A portion of the event began, a few hands went up with policy suggestions or small concerns. Then, without warning, Merritt rose. She didn't wait to be called on. "I don't have a question," she said. "I have a confession." Dozens of heads turned toward her. "I thought I was upholding the brand," Merritt said. "But what I really upheld was a wall, A wall that told some passengers, "This space isn't for you." I told them without shouting, without even knowing I was doing it. She swallowed. And for every time I made someone feel like they didn't belong, "I am sorry." There was no applause. Zarina didn't ask for any, but she nodded, slow and firm, not a gesture of forgiveness, but of truth recognized. Desmond Virel stepped up onto the stage. His face was tired but resolute. He spoke plainly. "Starting today, Altair is launching a company-wide program called Human First Protocol." He paused, scanning the room. "Not just for gate agents or flight crews, but for executives too. Every single person who wears the Altair name." He outlined the training. Bias awareness, restorative communication, passenger dignity, decision-making without prejudice. "This isn't damage control," he said. "It's a course correction. Because flying high means nothing if we forget who we're carrying." Later in the program, the stage was offered to those who had been on the receiving end of false complaints. Employees written up for being too assertive, too casual, not professional enough. One of them was Trina. She stepped onto the stage slowly, eyes scanning the crowd until they met Zarina's. "The first time I saw a passenger being treated unfairly, I didn't say anything," she admitted. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was someone else's decision, that I was too new to challenge it." She turned towards Zarina. "But I was there, and I didn't speak up. But I will from now on." Zarina didn't speak. She simply walked up and embraced her. There were no cameras flashing, no music swelling. Just two women, once separated by fear and silence, now standing on the same side of courage. Over the following days, airports across the country began to look slightly different. New signs were posted at Altair gates. Subtle but clear. "You belong here. Every seat, every voice matters." A former passenger saw one of the signs at the gate in Boston Logan and snapped a photo. They posted it on social media with a caption that said, "It's not about who sits in first class. It's about building a company where no one feels like a second-class human." That post was shared over 400,000 times. That night, back in her home in Chicago, Zarina sat in her kitchen with a hot cup of chamomile. She scrolled past the post, smiled gently, and powered her phone off. The window beside her showed the quiet street outside. No crowds, no news vans. Just her, a cup of tea, and a new kind of stillness. Not everything had changed, but from now on, every flight would start differently, because someone once asked her to step off, and instead, she chose to step up. It was just past 9 in the morning at Chicago O'Hare, and the terminal had that familiar midweek quiet. Coffee carts steaming, soft footsteps, occasional flight announcements echoing overhead. Zarina Claiborne sat near Gate B12, folded newspaper in hand, though her eyes weren't really on the headlines. She wasn't traveling for business. Not anymore. Not much. Today, her destination was Seattle, where she'd been invited to speak with a class of aviation students. Future industry leaders, they called them. She smiled at the thought. Most of them probably hadn't even heard of Flight 812, and that was okay. She didn't want her story to be a cautionary tale. She wanted it to be a reference point, something honest, something human. The boarding area around her buzzed gently. A gate agent greeted a passenger by name. A toddler clutched a stuffed fox while his mother adjusted his tiny mask. A flight attendant, walking briskly by with her tote, glanced at Zarina and nodded, not out of recognition, but out of basic decency. Zarina nodded back. And in that small gesture, something settled inside her. Change, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it looked like being addressed by your name without hesitation. Sometimes it looked like tea without sugar because someone remembered that's how you take it. Sometimes it was just not being questioned for existing in a seat you paid for. She used to believe change came from speeches, the powerful kind. Now she knew it came just as much from the ordinary done differently. She wasn't chasing a win. She never had been. She was just trying to feel peace. And today she did. Back at Altair Skyways, things were different now. Not perfect, but different. Employees were encouraged to speak up during pre-shift briefings. Posters in break rooms invited anonymous submissions for Voices Cabin Circle, a new initiative allowing staff and even passengers to share stories that needed hearing. Some were painful, some were hopeful, All were seen. Merritt Halbrook had quietly retired. No press statement. No press at all. She sent one internal letter before leaving, addressed to the entire Altair team. It read, "I used to think professionalism meant uniformity, but I've come to understand that true professionalism means holding space for difference and preserving dignity in that space. I'm not leaving because I failed. I'm leaving because I finally learned a lesson I resisted for too long." Zarina had read it. She didn't respond. But at a small employee roundtable a week later, she brought it up. Not to praise, not to condemn, but to acknowledge. Change, as she said, means someone dared to listen, eventually. Altair launched the first inclusive passenger council in the domestic aviation market soon after. A rotating panel of real passengers from all walks of life were invited to provide feedback on everything from seat assignments to in-flight language. When they offered Zarina an honorary chair, she declined. "Give that seat to someone who's never had one," she said. "That's the point." That same philosophy guided her actions even in the smallest moments. On her Seattle flight, she'd been assigned seat 1A, a courtesy for her role, a nod from the airline. But as she stepped onto the plane, she noticed a woman with two young children being redirected by a gate agent. The family had been split across 3 rows due to a booking error. Zarina didn't hesitate. She approached the woman gently, leaned in, and said, "Would you like to sit with your children? Take my seat. I'll switch." The woman's eyes welled up. "I don't even know your name." Zarina offered a soft smile. "That's okay. Just remember how it felt, and pass it on." She settled into a seat farther back near the wing. It was a little noisier, a little tighter, but just as much hers. By the time they landed, the woman and her kids were fast asleep in 1A and 1C. A flight attendant brought Zarina a warm cup of unsweetened tea. She thanked her, feeling something calm settle in her chest. That night, in her Seattle hotel room, she opened her laptop to check a few emails. One stood out. From Trina Marshall. Subject thought you should know, it read, "Today I stood up for a boy who was about to be moved away from his mom because he couldn't sit still. I remembered your story. I said something, and it mattered." Zarina didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned back in the hotel armchair, let her head rest against the cushion, and closed her eyes. That's the seat she had chosen to keep. Not the one up front, behind a curtain, next to a champagne tray, but the invisible seat, the one in people's minds and memories. The one that reminds them they're seen, that they matter. And in the stillness of that room, with nothing but the hum of the city outside, she smiled. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to hold a seat, it's to make room for someone else in it. Not every seat we give up is a loss. Sometimes it's the beginning of something greater. Zarina didn't just reclaim her place, she reshaped what belonging could look like for others. And maybe that's the real measure of change. Not how high we rise, but how many people we lift along the way. What about you? Have you ever given something up only to realize it opened a door for someone else? Tell us below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more true, powerful stories that stay with you long after they're told.